Today's lesson is from Matthew 21, verses 1 through 17. When they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this: the Lord needs them, and he will send them immediately." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and that followed were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest heaven!" When he had entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." Then Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the amazing things that he did and heard, the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they became angry and said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" Jesus said to them, "Yes. Have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise for yourself?" He left them, went out of the city to Bethany, and spent the night there. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Humility is not something 8-year-olds really get. I learned this when I was 10 while talking to my 8-year-old brother at dinner one night. You know the scene. A booth in a small but popular Italian restaurant. Dad and know-it-all daughter on one side, mom and can-do-it-all son on the other. Kids are bickering back and forth. The parents are absent-mindedly listening. A typical Thursday night in the Treywick household. Deep in conversation, my brother begins telling me everything that he is so good at. Basketball, baseball, running fast, drawing the best pictures, guitar, you name it. He's the best, he tells me. I, on the other hand, was not having it, so in typical prepubescent fashion, I rolled my eyes and scoffed, "Duncan, you need a lesson in humility." My brother, without missing a single beat, shouted loud enough to reverberate throughout the restaurant, "I could teach lessons in humility." My point exactly. Dad dropped his bread flat in the dipping oil and tried to hide his snickering. Mom, however, roared in laughter. The couple in the booth next to us chuckled quietly, and the waiter passing by almost dropped a tray of drinks but caught it at the last second. Duncan, fading back into the innocence 8-year-olds know all too well, bashfully leaned toward my mom's ear and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "Wait, what does it mean to be humble?" It was this memory of Duncan's question that came to mind for me while reading this passage of Jesus' humble entry into Jerusalem. Sweet, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, humble too, we learn. This passage in Matthew opens with Jesus riding from the Mount of Olives, humble and mounted on a donkey. As he rides, a very large crowd gathers in front and behind him, placing their cloaks and palm branches under the feet of his donkey, glorifying him and shouting, "Hosanna!" But a mere 2 verses later, our humble Jesus is expelling people from the temple, overturning tables, and screaming about a den of robbers. Then, to make matters more confusing, when we place this excerpt from Matthew into its wider context, Jesus goes from a praised and glorified prophet so glorified that the crowds will not let even the hooves of his donkey touch the ground. To a politically assassinated criminal in a matter of days. What does it mean to be humble? Matthew tells us that Jesus' humble entry into Jerusalem is done in fulfillment of the prophet Zechariah's prophecy in Zechariah 9, which may sound a bit familiar. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion, shout aloud, O Jerusalem. Your king comes to you triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. In order to fully understand Jesus' humility in Matthew, we need to understand what's going on in Zechariah and Matthew's purpose in quoting him to describe Jesus' entry into the holy city. Though Matthew only pulls a single verse to describe Jesus, what precedes and follows that verse in Zechariah is equally important. Zechariah 9, in a nutshell, is a story of a God who ultimately and eventually thwarts Israel's unjust enemies through the coming of a humble king. The prophet's chapter opens with a description of a few of Israel's foreign enemies. Tyre and Sidon are described as heaping up silver like dust and gold like the dirt on the streets. Zechariah continues to say that God will ultimately and eventually throw their wealth into the sea. He describes Israel's enemies as writhing in anguish and promises that no oppressor will ever overrun Israel. Cue Zechariah's humble king. When the humble king comes, Zechariah says he will cut off the chariots and the war horses of the nations, protecting Israel from its external enemies. Instead of meeting military power with military power, though, Zechariah's humble king demilitarizes the nations and invokes a rule of peace and dominion rather than one of power and domination. Is this what it means to be humble? As we return to Matthew with a little understanding of the prophet he is quoting, we see that Jesus' entry into Jerusalem is no parade. It's a political protest. By referencing Zechariah 9 and explicitly calling Jesus' entry into Jerusalem a fulfillment of that prophecy, Matthew suggests to the crowds who know Zechariah's prophetic tradition that Jesus comes to destroy Israel's enemies. This is what makes it all the more shocking when our humble Jesus turns to the temple. When Jesus enters Jerusalem, we are told that the city is in turmoil, or perhaps a better translation, the city was quaking, as in an earthquake. This language conjures images from Zechariah 9, where Israel's external enemies writhe with fear and anguish. This time, though, instead of the humble king confronting Israel's external enemies, he turns toward the temple as if to say that the temple itself has become complicit in the rule of the Roman Empire, subjugating the poor, turning the place of worship into a marketplace, banning the lame, banning the blind, banning the children from entering the house of worship, but not banning the guns. 3 days ago, 50 Muslims were murdered while they prayed in their house of worship when a white supremacist marched into a New Zealand mosque and opened fire in the name of white supremacy. In an 87-page manifesto, he called his Muslim neighbors invaders and cited the American president, our president, as a symbol of white identity. 5 months ago, a white supremacist marched into a Pittsburgh synagogue and murdered 11 Jews while they prayed in their house of worship. As he pulled the trigger, he shouted anti-Semitic slogans. And in the months leading up to the attack, he too repeatedly called immigrants invaders and grossly claimed that Jews are the children of Satan. 4 years ago, a white supremacist walked into a Charleston AME church and murdered 9 African Americans as they prayed in their house of worship. His social media account showed a history of racist slurs, identification with white identity groups, and numerous pictures glorifying guns and the Confederate flag. His goal, he tells us, to start an American race war. In each traumatic event, each dramatic display of America's, of the world's white empire, the church has had the responsibility to respond in a visionary way. And yet, the dominating response seems to come from the empire itself. Our thoughts and prayers are with you.
Hey, come on.
Our thoughts and prayers are with the victims and their families. We offer our thoughts and our prayers. While thoughts and prayers have their place, I'm struck that our humble Jesus did not turn to the temple's injustice with thoughts and prayers.
Hey, come on.
Our humble Jesus got mad. He overturned tables and shouted at the injustice he witnessed and lamented that the temple had become so complacent, making money off the oppressed, shutting people out. At the end of the passage, though, Jesus invites the blind and the lame and the children to him and shows a new way of being the temple. To describe Jesus as humble is not to say that he is gentle or that he is weak. To say Jesus is humble is to proclaim that he has positioned himself with the humiliated ones. And in doing so has actively confronted the way his own tradition has grown complacent in the ways of the empire.
That's good.
I think this is what it means to be humble. Today, this day, 3 days after the New Zealand attack, the church has a chance to stand up and stand out apart from the empire. What will we do? We will continue to gather and to pray, of course. But what next? Our history of response in moments of violence like these, it's not strong. Generally consists of a pleasant statement, thoughts, prayers, but never fully denouncing, never entirely acknowledging the white supremacy on which the American Christian church was built.
Come on.
For too long, we have heaped up silver like dust. For too long, we have cut people out. For too long, we have blended with the empire.
Amen.
So what will be different this time? Here at Columbia Theological Seminary, we are a community of ministry leaders in many a form. As leaders, how are we preparing in the here and now to deconstruct white supremacy in our congregations, in our organizations, on our campus? How are we preparing to confront the racist histories of our institutions? How are we moving the conversation from colorblindness and some perverted version of John 3:16 Christianity that keeps us from seeing our non-white, non-Christian neighbors as fully human and fully God's? What will we do differently this time? Jesus showed us that empires don't topple with thoughts and prayers alone.
Come on, Pastor.
Empires topple when we put our bodies, our church body, near the humiliated one so that we are in honest and genuine relationship with them, in partnership with them, working for their justice and their liberation. Jesus' death was political.
Hey.
So maybe our lives should be.